At 2:13 in the morning, on a gravel road in South Finwasta, a 19-year-old college student sat in a car that would not move. He was not hurt. He was not lost, not yet, not in his own mind. He picked up his phone and called the two people he trusted most in the world. For the next 47 minutes, his father would stay on that line, driving through the dark, trying to find his son by the sound of his voice alone. Then, without warning, Brandon Swanson said two words. And then there was nothing. No goodbye, no scream, just silence and a phone that would ring and ring into a void for the next 17 years. This is the story of a young man who was 3 feet from his own front porch light and who somehow never came home. Marshall, Minnesota is the kind of town where everybody's business becomes everybody's business in the gentlest possible way. Around 13,000 people, flat horizons, grain elevators standing like watchtowers over the fields. Brandon Victor Swanson grew up here, the kind of kid teachers describe using words like dependable and curious, never delinquent, never a warning sign in his file. He graduated high school in 2007 and, instead of rushing off to a 4-year university like some of his friends, he stayed close to home for 1 more year. He enrolled in a technical program studying wind turbines, chasing an interest that felt almost prophetic for a state covered in farmland and open sky. He had already been accepted to a college out of state for the following fall. He had plans, he had momentum. May 13, 2008 was supposed to be nothing but a good night. It was the final day of the spring semester. Brandon and his classmates had made it through, and like students everywhere on the last day of finals, they wanted to celebrate. There was a gathering in Canby, the small town where his technical college was located. Friends remember him in a good mood, laughing, having a few drinks, but nothing that alarmed anyone who knew him. This was not a young man spiraling, this was a young man closing one chapter of his life and getting ready to open another. But somewhere between that party and his home in Marshall, something shifted. Instead of taking the direct route home, along the highway he would have driven 100 times before, Brandon chose the back roads, gravel roads, unlit roads that wind between fields with no streetlights, no landmarks, nothing to orient a driver except a memory of turns taken in daylight. Nobody has ever been able to say for certain why he made that choice. Maybe he wanted to avoid the possibility of being pulled over. Maybe it simply felt like the shorter way. Whatever the reason, it placed him, alone, in the kind of rural darkness that swallows a car's headlights whole. Just after midnight, driving those back roads, Brandon made a turn he believed led onto solid gravel. It didn't. His car dropped into a ditch, hard enough to leave him stuck, but not hard enough to hurt him. He was shaken, he was frustrated, but he was fine. He climbed out, checked his phone, and did exactly what any reasonable 19-year-old would do in that moment. He called his parents. Brian and Annette Swanson picked up the phone somewhere close to 2 in the morning to hear their son's voice, embarrassed but steady, explaining that he'd gotten stuck and needed a ride. He told them he thought he was near a small town called Lind, not far from Marshall at all. It was the kind of call that thousands of parents have received from thousands of teenagers over thousands of ordinary nights. Brian got in the truck immediately. Annette stayed on the phone with Brandon, trying to help him figure out exactly where he was so they could come find him faster. This is where the case stops being an ordinary story about a stuck car and starts becoming something else entirely. Brandon told his parents he could see lights in the distance, and he thought if he started walking toward them, he could get to a spot where they could find him more easily. So he began to walk. In the dark, along roads he didn't fully recognize, narrating his surroundings to his mother over the phone, describing fields, describing distant lights, describing landmarks that made sense to him, but that his parents, driving in circles near Lind, could not match to anything in front of them. For 47 minutes this continued. A mother on the phone, trying to picture a landscape she couldn't see. A father driving a route that, unbeknownst to any of them, was nowhere near where his son actually stood. Anyone who has ever tried to give directions to someone lost in the dark knows the particular rising anxiety of that kind of call, the sense that the map in your head and the map in theirs have quietly stopped matching. And then, 47 minutes in, Brandon said something. Witnesses to the call, his own parents, have described it consistently over the years. He exclaimed two words: sudden, sharp. The kind of thing a person says when they are startled or when they've just stepped somewhere they didn't expect. "Oh, shit." And then the line went dead. Not a dropped call with static, not a voice trailing into nothing, a hard, sudden stop. His parents tried calling back immediately. Nothing. They tried again. Nothing. Somewhere around 6:30 that morning, after hours of trying to reach their son and failing, they did the only thing left to do. They called the police. What happened next is, in its own quiet way, one of the most unsettling parts of this entire case. Not because of what it reveals about Brandon, but because of what it reveals about how a missing persons case can be allowed to slip through the cracks in its most critical hours. When Annette Swanson explained the situation to law enforcement, she was met not with urgency, but with a kind of bureaucratic shrug. Brandon was 19. He was a legal adult. According to the officers she spoke with, it wasn't unusual for a young man his age to disappear for a night. He had every right, they told her, to simply not come home. Imagine being told that about your own child, hours after hearing him vanish mid-sentence on a phone call you will never stop replaying in your mind. It would take the passage of more time and mounting pressure from a family who refused to accept that explanation before authorities treated Brandon's disappearance with the seriousness it deserved, and once they did, the case only grew stranger. Investigators pulled Brandon's cell phone records, expecting them to confirm what everyone already believed, that he had been near Lind, exactly where he told his parents he was, exactly where they had been driving in circles trying to find him. Instead, the records placed his phone's location roughly 25 miles away, near the town of Porter, close to a road called Taunton. 25 miles. Not a rounding error, not a quirk of imprecise cell tower triangulation. A gap large enough that it meant one of two things. Either the technology was wrong, or Brandon himself had no idea where he actually was that night, despite describing a landscape to his mother with what sounded, at the time, like confidence. It is a small detail that carries an enormous psychological weight, because it means that for 47 minutes, two people who loved him more than anyone were trying to rescue a man from a location that did not exist. They were searching the wrong roads, the wrong fields, the wrong stretch of darkness, guided by a description that, however sincere, may have been describing an entirely different place. Search efforts began in earnest once the discrepancy came to light. Search dogs, helicopters, hundreds of volunteers, and law enforcement from multiple agencies converged on the area near where the cell records placed him. Brandon's car was found abandoned in a ditch, doors open, keys missing, no blood, no sign of struggle, no indication of an accident violent enough to explain a disappearance. Just an empty vehicle sitting in the dark, as if its driver had simply stepped out and never come back. The search dogs picked up a scent. It led them toward the banks of the Yellow Medicine River, a waterway that at the time was running high and fast from spring rain and snowmelt. In some stretches, it's barely knee-deep. In others, it drops to 15 feet. For a long time, investigators operated under the theory that Brandon had, in the darkness and disorientation of that night, stumbled into the river and drowned. It's a theory that makes a certain grim sense. A stressed, possibly impaired young man, walking alone through unfamiliar terrain in the pitch dark, could easily misjudge a riverbank. But the theory has a problem, and it's one that has haunted this case for close to 2 decades. Rivers give bodies back. Currents push them downstream. They surface. They get caught on debris, discovered by fishermen, spotted by search parties, combing the banks for miles in either direction. Search teams did exactly that for years, and Yellow Medicine River never gave up anything. The scent trail the dogs followed simply stopped at the water's edge, and stopped meaning anything at all. What followed was one of the longest, most exhaustive search efforts for a single missing person in Minnesota's history. Search and rescue teams didn't give up after the first week or the first month. They came back in the fall after the surrounding farm fields had been harvested and the ground was finally clear enough to walk. They came back again in the spring after the snow melted, but before new crops were planted, a narrow seasonal window that repeated year after year. Eventually, investigators calculated that they had combed through more than 120 square miles of land and water. A local sheriff reportedly walked the same 2-mile stretch of riverbank every single day for a month, simply because he couldn't stop looking. They found nothing. Not a body, not clothing, not the phone that had gone dead mid-sentence. Nothing at all in all that open ground to explain where a 19-year-old man had gone. In the absence of physical evidence, theories multiplied, the way they always do when a case refuses to close. Some believe Brandon really did drown, and that the river simply never released him, an outcome rare but not impossible in certain currents and debris fields. Others floated the idea of a hit and run, a car strike out on those dark back roads followed by a panicked cover-up. But investigators found no physical evidence of a collision anywhere along his known route, no debris, no skid marks, nothing consistent with that scenario. Still others have wondered whether Brandon simply walked away from his own life, overwhelmed by pressures no one around him had noticed. But those closest to him have pushed back hard on that idea. He had just finished a program he was proud of. He had plans to move away for school in the fall, plans he seemed genuinely excited about. And it strains belief that a young man plotting to vanish and start a secret new life would spend his final 47 minutes keeping his own father on the phone, describing his surroundings in detail, sounding like someone trying desperately to be found rather than someone trying to disappear. And then there is the most unsettling theory of all, the one that investigators have never been able to fully rule out, precisely because there is no evidence either way. That someone else was out on those roads that night, and that Brandon's exclamation, that sudden, startled, "Oh, shit," wasn't him tripping, or stepping into cold water, or losing his footing in the dark. That it was him reacting to something, or someone he didn't expect to see. Nobody knows. That's the uncomfortable truth at the center of this entire case. 17 years, over 100 square miles searched, and the honest answer to what happened to Brandon Swanson is still, simply, we don't know. What his disappearance did produce, undeniably, was change. Brian and Annette Swanson refused to let their son's case, or the way it was initially handled, fade quietly into a filing cabinet. They pushed the Minnesota legislature to pass what became known as Brandon's Law, requiring police to begin an immediate investigation whenever an adult goes missing under dangerous or unexplained circumstances, rather than assuming, as the officers on that first morning had, that an adult simply has the right to vanish. The law passed. The governor signed it, with the Swanson family standing beside him. In the years since, similar laws have been introduced in other states, an entire piece of legislation born out of one family's worst night, meant to spare other families those same wasted, irretrievable hours. For years afterward, the Swansons left their porch light on every single night, a small and steady signal that if Brandon ever found his way back, home would still be lit and waiting. It's the kind of detail that says more about a family's grief than any official case file ever could. As of today, Brandon Swanson has never been found. His phone has never surfaced. No confirmed remains have ever been recovered. His case remains open with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and it remains listed with the FBI among the nation's unresolved missing person cases. Every year that passes without an answer only deepens the central haunting question of this story. Not simply where did Brandon go, but how does a person walking down a road, describing his own surroundings out loud to the people who love him most, end up somewhere that doesn't match a single word of what he said? Was he simply disoriented in the dark, describing a place his own mind had already gotten wrong? Or did something happen in those final moments that had nothing to do with confusion at all? Somewhere in southwestern Minnesota, there's still a stretch of gravel road and a riverbank and 120 square miles of farmland that were searched inch by inch and gave up nothing. And somewhere in the space between two words and a dead phone line is the answer nobody has ever found. If you had been on that phone call straining to hear a description of a place you couldn't see, what do you think you would have heard in his voice?